In the last 2 years of school, I moved into the back garage at our place. It was good because it was standalone and it had rear street access. And friends from school could drop in or sneak in, maybe is a better word to use, mostly undetected. And we could smoke some weed and then listen to Pink Floyd. We thought Pink Floyd made music specifically for stoned people. The Great Gig in the Sky was like a religious hymn that could make you soar upwards towards the angels. When I first heard the bells in Dark Side of the Moon, it sounded like ancient bells ringing out from a far distant past to me. It's hard to explain, but there was something ringing out from the deep past, and there was some kind of new epoch beginning. That's the thing about smoking weed. It makes you start thinking about aeons and epochs and things like that, as well as where does the hippie trail go. Anyway, it was mostly intuitive and hard to express. There were only nascent hints of deep mysteries. One of the biggest mysteries was, how did Pink Floyd get from their 60s album, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, to The Dark Side of the Moon? Did that have anything to do with Syd Barrett taking one too many trips? We held long and meandering conversations about all of these things and looked at them from many different angles. We could have been drawn together by the fact that we didn't trust anyone over 28. And the biggest mystery was the 1950s. We were trying to understand why straight people did some of the things they did. What did they do all day prior to the Jimi Hendrix experience? They were probably just putting up parking lots if you listen to Joni Mitchell. One of the main things about the 1950s, which always had to be kept in mind, was that never before had so many straight people been gathered together in the same place at the same time. And that is what made the 1950s an almost impenetrable mystery. And you shouldn't criticize what you don't understand, as Bob Dylan said. And what some straight people didn't seem to understand is that we had a name. We were trying to get to the bottom of Sixties philosophy. It was just that it was taking way longer than expected. And we held long and meandering conversations about some of the main 60s albums and the main artists. We thought Bob Dylan was a genius who held the secrets to 60s philosophy if we could just understand his lyrics better. And Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young sounded like the 60s. The Beatles had to be geniuses, but even parents like Paul McCartney, which wasn't a good song. And many friends dropped in and out of those garage sessions. H could tell you every 60s album that had ever been made. And you have to remember that this was way before Google. Kim wanted to be a writer and had read French authors like Camus, which I found impressive. And Gary was mostly fixated on the ritual and on what strain of weed we had and on what side of the hill had been grown. Frankie and Ariane were two sisters from France. And come to think of it, they didn't come from our school, but no one seemed to be arguing about it. But seriously, who's going to argue about two sisters from France? Anyway, the French had a history of revolution, so they deserved to be there. I had decorated that garage by myself. The first thing I did was move in two massive matte black speakers with woofers and subwoofers and things like that. They looked like they'd fallen off the back of Pink Floyd's tour bus. Then there were bean bags strewn everywhere all around so that we could hold our long conversations. There was a single Modigliani print, which was my pretense at sophistication. Then there was the beginnings of a countercultural library with 1984 from George Orwell, who was a counter-cultural hero, and Brave New World from Aldous Huxley. And then there was To Have or To Be from Erich Fromm. And maybe for many of us at that time, Erich Fromm was one of our first introductions into psychology. I also had every book from Hermann Hesse. It could have been Siddhartha that opened me up to the inner life, but I'm not sure about that, and it could have been Pink Floyd, or it might have been weed. And this could be a bit of an excursion, but one day in one of those garage sessions, we decided to roll one of the world's biggest numbers. I was about to light up when my mother walked in, and she looked at me and then looked at everyone else and said, "Could you see me upstairs?" Which didn't sound good, but I went upstairs anyway. And when I got there, she said, "John, you were smoking marijuana down there, weren't you?" And I ummed and ahed and maybe even thought about lying, but eventually said, "Well, yes." And then she said, "I would like to try some." And for some reason that freaked me out. And I thought maybe she was having an existential crisis or going off the rails. I was stalling for time and I said, "I'll have to talk to my friends about it." Don't get me wrong, my mother was a beautiful person, but up to that point, she'd never even smoked a cigarette. And I didn't want to be responsible for her turning into a hippie and becoming unsupervised and having hallucinations. I was also semi-disgusted because the revolution wasn't meant to be a family event. And what type of revolution is it if your mother wants to join in? And I was still mad at her for hugging and kissing me in front of my friends and saying, "He will always be my lovely boy." I was worried about my street credibility. Then I went downstairs and made the announcement. My mother wants to join the revolution. I don't know why things seem so funny when you've been smoking weed. Anyway, we talked about it for some time, which could have been, I don't know, for 5 minutes or maybe a few hours. I put forward the theory that maybe she was already producing THC in her brain. She was already laughing and hugging people randomly. And I didn't think that we should give her any weed under any circumstances because you never knew what could happen if you got your parents stoned. Anyway, we decided not to give her any weed because we couldn't guarantee everyone's safety. But we thought that if we maybe could let her listen to Pink Floyd first and then take it from there. Looking back on it, maybe we should have let her join our revolutionary cell because she was only pretending to be mainstream sometimes. But at the time, it felt like we were striking out on our own, and I was making a show out of my independence. And I was also scared that, well, at the time, I was also scared that she had a plan to keep me at home until I was 50 or 60, or maybe even longer. But getting back to the 60s, there was something in the air, said Thunderclap Newman. Something happening around here, said Buffalo Springfield. There's something blowing in the wind, Bob Dylan said. The times they are changing, he said. It felt like there was some kind of adventurous free spirit blowing in the wind. I didn't always understand Bob Dylan because he spoke in strange mercurial tongues and in fast and flashing poetic images. But I did know he was a mercurial messenger and a prophetic voice. And he had probably said that everyone must get stoned so that they could understand his lyrics. The old road is aging, he said. There might be people that liked the old order best, but what was true in the 1950s was no longer true in the 60s. Come senators, congressmen, he said, please heed the call. Don't stand in the hallway. Don't block up the door. That was directed to whoever was standing in the old institutional hallways of power. To the Senex old men, to the senators and congressmen. All he was saying was, please don't stand in the hallways and block up the doors and stand in the way of the new spirit of the times. In the chimes of freedom, the sky was like a wild cathedral, he said. There was a thunder and lightning striking like a primitive force. It was shattering the old reality. It was radically altering the universe. It was changing the cosmological situation. It wasn't the 60s youth that had started the 60s revolution. It was the thunder and the lightning. The sky was cracking its poems in naked wonder, he said. I sometimes sat in naked wonder listening to the lyrics and could feel the thunder and lightning striking like a primitive force, and how the sky was cracking its poems and they were falling down to earth and into some of the 60s musicians and artists and poets and into their songs and into their lyrics. It was like the 60s version of the Revelations. It's what people don't always understand about the 60s, is that there was something mystical or religious about the 60s vision. And I know that some people might see this through the errancy of a wayward youth, and that could be true. But if I look back on my 16 or 17-year-old self, I just see someone who was a seeker, experimenting. And I can look back fondly on the self-exploration and the discovery of that time. And I would say, as you get older, one reflects on these things and one tries to integrate them. And when I look back now, I would say, with 60s philosophy, it wasn't always maybe so conscious at the time, but I would say if I look at it from an archetypal perspective, there were two very powerful archetypal forces kind of erupting or emerging at that time, which were influencing the 60s experience. I can see some of the poor youth in the 60s, the pure wandering idealism and creativity. The pure is like the eternal youth. And the 60s adventure was like a pure adventure in many ways. In some ways, it was like a clash between the Senex old man and the youth. In any case, I've already got a video up on the 60s as like the rise of the poor. But so to me, that was like a huge archetypal force that was emerging in the 60s. But there was another one. And that was like the Dionysian loosening. Sometimes when I look at the images of Jim Morrison, he reminds me of what Dionysus would look like. And if I look at the 60s from an archetypal perspective, I see it as a Dionysian revolution. It was like a Dionysian loosening where the walls of the psyche were becoming more permeable. It was like that Doors song, Breaking Through to the Other Side. It was like the 60s youth were kind of going into the unconscious. First off, there was Elvis, who started moving his hips in the 1950s, which shook up the 50s. And then Jim Morrison came along and entered the stage like some kind of a Dionysian figure, maybe even a shaman figure, or as some kind of Dionysian rider of the storm. In any case, I'm following up on this video, and soon I'm going to be looking at the 60s as a Dionysian revolution.